Good morning, everyone, and welcome to St. Francis Episcopal Church in Greensboro, North Carolina. We are pleased to be joined virtually by a special guest this morning, but before we undertake introductions, let us begin our time together with prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray using the words of Psalm 19. May the words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. This morning, just a reminder to please hold your questions. We'll have a question and answer time once Dr. Ladner finishes with her presentation. And we want to be sure to you'll need to use the microphone, which we'll pass around for that question and answer period. Our guest, Keri Ladner, earned her PhD at the University of Edinburgh and specializes in the intersection of fundamentalist religion and American politics. Dr. Ladner is the author of American Dominion, The Rise and Radicalization of a New Christendom, recently published in April of 2026. And I'll hold this behind me so you see her book, and this was the book on the flyers that we had put out in our news media. And she's also the author of End Time Politics, From Moral Majority to QAnon, published in 2024. Dr. Ladner's publications have been featured in a number of media outlets, including Religious Dispatches, Good Faith Media, and The Christian Century. In fact, I personally became acquainted with Dr. Ladner's writing through The Christian Century. As I already let Dr. Ladner know, this past autumn, 2025, during the adult formation sessions on Sunday morning at St. Francis, we explored the topic, Unraveling the Strands of Christian Nationalism. Christian dominionism, or dominion theology, was one of the strands of Christian nationalism that we engaged with this past autumn. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Ladner to St. Francis. We are pleased that you have joined us, and we look forward to hearing, learning, and understanding a little bit more about dominionism.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And yes, we've been hearing a lot of talk about Christian nationalism lately, and rightly so, because there has been a surge of expression in the belief that America is for Christians, or at least that America is for a certain kind of Christian. And we see this reflected in the White House's plans for America 250, and we see this in current immigration enforcement, and we see it in attacks on our public schools. I do not like to use the term Christian nationalism because it can be very vague and can mean just about anything that we want it to mean. Instead, for right now, I want to keep our focus on what you said is a strand of Christian nationalism, and that's dominionism, or dominion theology. And that's the topic of my recent book, American Dominion. Now, I want to point out in the title, I called it American Dominion, The Rise and Radicalization of a New Christendom, because Christendom generally refers to a merger of Christianity and politics. We saw this really in the Middle Ages, and the goal for a lot of the dominionists who currently have the reins of power is to recreate that kind of a model. Dominionism makes one of two parallel claims. The first claim that dominionism makes is that God has given Christians dominion over all things, and that dominion is simply ours to claim. And I want to be cautious here that dominionists do not refer to everyone who considers themselves to be a Christian as having dominion over all things. They're referring to a particular kind of Christian. And this is usually charismatic evangelicals who emphasize belief in the demonic, not just demons as a metaphor for the struggles that we face every day, but literal demons as the source of all of our problems. Exorcisms along with faith healing and speaking in tongues. The general idea here is that Satan took dominion over the planet when Adam and Eve sinned, but Christ reclaimed that dominion over earth and he gave it to his followers. And as a result of this, we are to lay stake and claim the dominion that is already ours, that Christ already gave to us. And supposedly a lot of that work is done by casting out demons. And we've watched many, many times as rhetoric from these dominionists veers into considering other people to be demons or to be demonized because they disagree with this agenda. And so in other words, they see themselves as taking the dominion that is already theirs by getting rid of the people that they disagree with, claiming that those people are demonized. To these individuals, to these dominionists, America is already ours. The government is already ours. The education system is already ours. The media is ours. Healthcare is ours. Christ gave us these things. We need only to lay claim to them and cause them to conform to a certain understanding of the kingdom of God. So in effect, the American government is supposed to be the kingdom of God on earth. And that's part of what these dominionists call the Seven Mountain Mandate, which says that we're to take dominion over all the mountains of culture. The parallel claim to this is it looks a lot the same, it sounds a lot the same, it's practiced by a different breed of dominionists. It says that Christ wants us to take dominion over all things. So the government is not ours, or it's not ours yet. It wasn't ours until recently. It's our job to take it over. It's our job to finish what was begun in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump. And this is where we find Doug Wilson. He's the leader of the group of churches to which Pete Hegseth belongs. And Wilson leads prayer meetings at the Pentagon. And when he does so, this is what he has in mind, that Christ has called me to take dominion over this place, over America's armed forces, over President Trump's cabinet, and by extension, he's called me to take dominion over everything that these institutions touch. That's the really big picture of what we're looking at that's happening nationally. I want to take a moment and focus on where these ideas developed and how they gained the cultural currency that they now have, and that's in churches. It is very, very easy to dismiss the message of dominionism. It is not based in historical Christian thought. It is not taught in seminaries. It's very easy to dismiss it. It's very easy to find fault in sermons that emphasize America as a Christian nation. It's very easy to look at the America Reads the Bible event that happened last month and just say, that's a whole bunch of crazies. Or it's easy to look at the overt Christian nationalism around the White House's America 250 event and say, that does not represent us. That dismissing this is easy. What's really hard is understanding that this movement has grown among people who are very much like us. And they may attend church for the same reasons that we do. And they truly believe that the Trump administration is enacting God's plan for America. At the heart of this agenda is public education. Attacks on public education did not begin with Project 2025, and they did not begin even before that with Betsy DeVos in Trump's first term with her pushing school vouchers. They go back to the godfather of this movement. He's a man named Rouse's John Rushdoony, and his teachings directly inspired Doug Wilson, who, again, is the spiritual leader of Pete Hegseth and has a very strong presence at the Pentagon. In 1963, Rushdoony published a book called The Messianic Character of American Education. And this book laid out his belief that a centralized public school system is actually the government's effort at playing God. The government has taken over the role of educating children, and this is a role that God has given to the family. And so by taking over this role of educating children, the government is playing God. And from there, he argued that public schools, he called them government schools, need to be abolished completely. We need to just turn down the entire public school system in favor of church-run Christian schools and homeschooling. Let's take a closer look at Rushdoony to understand where he was coming from. Because this is a really bold claim. There are a lot of people who think that his arguments are watertight. But before we look at whether his arguments are watertight, maybe we need to look at what his influences were. First off, he was a neo-Confederate. He drew heavily on the work of a theologian named Robert Louis Dabney. Dabney was actually the chaplain to the Confederate General Stonewall Jackson during the Civil War. And he believed that the Confederacy represented God's ideal plan for society. Dabney claimed that the Confederacy was built on a biblical model, and Rushdoony believed the same thing. And because there were not public schools in the Confederacy, because it was, in many ways, was a collection of fiefdoms, that's what Rushdoony was using the Bible to legitimize and to try to recreate, but on a national level. It is not a far leap to say that Rushdoony was extremely racist. He believed that kidnapping Africans from their homeland, bringing them across the ocean on slave ships, and forcing them to work on plantations was a good thing because slaves had the opportunity to become Christians. And he was also a Holocaust denier. So even if we can say for a moment that his arguments about public schools playing God are watertight, even if for a moment we can agree to what he's saying, we can step back and say, maybe we shouldn't listen to this because this is coming from a neo-Confederate Holocaust denier. But his acolyte, Doug Wilson, is a regular at the Pentagon, so we need to understand this. We need to be paying attention to this. We need to understand what is going on so that we can do something about it. And by the way, Doug Wilson is in favor of slavery. We need to know this. We need to be talking about the fact that the spiritual leader of the Pentagon is in favor of slavery. When Jerry Falwell and his cohort first organized the religious right during the 1970s, Rushdoony's ideas were too extreme for them. And it's saying something for something to be too extreme for Jerry Falwell. I wrote my doctoral thesis on Falwell, and he was crazy. But the religious right was still organized around opposition to public schools, especially because of the forced integration of public schools in the South. For Falwell and his ilk, the crusade was about ensuring that white Christian children did not have to attend school with African American children. And for a while, he was trying to get public schools shut down altogether to prevent integration. When that didn't work, he organized conservative evangelicals into a massive voting bloc that we call the religious right in order to undermine integration efforts. And he later said that the whole thing had always been about abortion. He never even preached about abortion until 20 years after he had been working against integration efforts. Falwell was not a dominionist. He did not even believe that his plan to make America righteous before God would actually succeed. But Rushdoony and his followers believed that they would succeed, even if doing so took hundreds of years. His influence was particularly seen at the Heritage Foundation during the 1980s, and the Heritage Foundation is the organization that gave us Project 2025. I wrote about this history in American Dominion, and I would encourage you guys to read a copy of it if you're interested in that background of the Heritage Foundation and the rise of Dominion theology within politics. What we're seeing happen now with our public schools is not an accident, and it's not even an anomaly. It's the culmination of more than 60 years of efforts to delegitimize and destroy our public schools. And these efforts came from organizations that were extremely well-funded and were ready to move forward with their vision as soon as they found the right politician. I bring up this focus on public schools because I want to help you answer the question of what can we do about Christian nationalism or dominionism. The single best thing you can do to push back against what is occurring nationally and locally is to support your local public schools. Where I live in Texas, public schools now teach a blatantly Christian nationalist curriculum to children as young as 5 years old. Kindergartners have to learn that the Sermon on the Mount is the foundation of Western civilization. And honestly, I'm really confused on this one. I have 3 theological degrees, and I did not know that the Sermon on the Mount was the foundation of Western civilization, but we're now teaching that to kindergartners. But go to school board meetings, find out who's running in school board elections, and vote in school board elections. They tend to have very low turnout, but that is where dominionism has been growing for decades with nobody even noticing, was in local school board elections. There's a lot of things that you can do to support the public schools in your community and make sure that they are meeting the needs of kids and not serving political interests. But on that note, I want to take a minute to talk about school vouchers. And Texas now provides vouchers to help pay for children to attend private Christian schools with the justification that they're giving families more choices. So I want to take a second to say, okay, let's agree with you for a minute that what you are doing by providing private school vouchers is actually, in fact, giving families more choices. If that is true, pretend that's true for a moment. Let me ask you, how many of you know a child who has special needs and you love that child more than life itself? Like, you would take a bullet for that child who has special needs and not even think about it. I know I'm right there. Most everyone I talk to knows and loves a child who has special needs. Are private schools required to meet the needs of children who have special needs, even if that child comes to them with a voucher that is funded with taxpayer dollars? The answer is no. Private schools do not have to even admit children with special needs, regardless of whether they come with a tax-funded school voucher. Public schools are a lifeline for children who have special needs and for the families who care for them. So I want to give you this tool of how you can avoid an argument about Christian nationalism and get right to the heart of the matter. If someone tries to challenge you or get into an argument about Christian nationalism or school vouchers or public schools, just ask them, is there a child in your life who has special needs? I want to close this part of our time together by reading to you one of my favorite verses, which is Luke 4:18. The first part of this verse says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor." Jesus was referring to an Old Testament prophet here, quoting from Isaiah, and his listeners would have known that immediately. They would have recognized this immediately as soon as he quoted these words. He said that this is the evidence that the Spirit of the Lord is on me, that the good news is preached to the poor. So let's ask ourselves, what is our message to the poor, to the marginalized, to those who live in the shadows? If our message is not good news to the poor, then it's not the gospel. If it is good news for the billionaire, but not good news for the family caring for a child with special needs, then it's not the gospel. It's just Christian nationalism, and Christian nationalism is a very poor substitute. So that's what I had prepared to talk with you about, and I want to move into questions and answers that, looking at answering some questions that you guys may have.
This is no questions? Okay. We all just close.
Thank you very much for being here. Recently, and I don't know if you've seen this, but Congresswoman Virginia Fox responded to a 10-year-old boy's letter, and she condemned his teachers for brainwashing him on democracy. And the mother of this child put the letter out, and it was not only hurtful and insulting to the 10-year-old, but to all of the teachers that she accused of brainwashing this child with ideas that were, I would say, anti-Christian nationalism. Are you aware of that?
I'm not aware of that specific incident, but I have to say that it doesn't surprise me. I live very close to South Lake. If any of you guys have read the book about They Came for the Schools is the name of it. It's by Mike Hixenbaugh. He's a reporter for NBC. He did a podcast series about it a couple of years ago, showing how South Lake, Texas was really ground zero in many ways for this Christian nationalist takeover of public schools. And that's not an accident. South Lake is home to one of the most, until a couple of years ago, what was one of the most successful megachurches in the country, which is Gateway Church. Gateway has been in the news a lot over the past couple of years because the founding pastor, Robert Morris, he served on Donald Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board during the first term. But then 2 years ago, it came out that Morris had actually assaulted a child over the course of several years back in the 1980s. And I've visited Gateway Church many times, and I heard Robert Morris say in sermons, "I had an affair," and he didn't say that his affair was with a 12-year-old child. Anyway, so it had 100,000 people. Gateway Church had 100,000 people based in South Lake, and they took a very prominent role in school board elections there. You also have in South Lake Lance Wallnau. That's where he lives and where his ministry is based. Lance Wallnau is one of the preeminent expositors of the Seven Mountain Mandate. One of those mountains is the mountain of education, and he has been working tirelessly for about 20 years now, promoting this idea that we are to take over the mountain of education. And then you also have in South Lake this organization called ZICLAC, which is a collection of, it's like a think tank. And to be a part of it, you have to be a Christian donor with a family fortune that's worth millions of dollars. And so you see the Kathy family from Chick-fil-A is here. Betsy DeVos's family is present in ZICLAC, and they have organized around taking over the seven mountains, one of them being the mountain of education. And so what we saw happen in South Lake a few years ago is all of this powerful money and all of these powerful forces. And South Lake is an extremely wealthy area. They came together to basically take over the mountain of education and show this is how we're going to do it. This is going to be our template for taking over school boards throughout the rest of the country. And so now they absolutely villainize the teacher, absolutely just demonize the teachers in the school district. And many of them received threats from the parents. And this was, it was orchestrated from the top down to create basically a parents' revolt against the teachers in the South Lake School District. But this had actually been brewing for decades. I show this in American Dominion. There's a man named Ralph Reed who formed the Christian Coalition in I believe the early 1990s. And his goal all along was, Jerry Falwell was about, let's take over the highest branches, the highest levels of government. Let's elect a president. Let's elect senators, elect representatives. Let's get justices on the Supreme Court. Ralph Reed was like, no, we're going to work on the school boards. I want to get school board members elected on local levels who are going to advance our agenda at the most basic grassroots level. And he famously said, I would rather have 1,000 school board members than the president. Like, I would rather, have control of 1,000, or maybe it was 1,000 school boards. I'd rather have control of 1,000 school boards than have control of the White House, pretty much, is what he believed. So this organizing to take over school boards, it was going on for decades with the plan, the explicit plan by Ralph Reed. This is how we're going to turn America into a Christian nation. So this has been going on for decades. And again, it comes back to the public schools. The most important thing that we can do to push back against this is to support our public schools.
Dr. Ladner, I was wondering, since the terminology for some folks among us this morning about the 7 mountain mandates, if you could just briefly explain it. And it's very interesting that our first reading in our worship service this morning for Trinity Sunday was from the whole first chapter of the book of Genesis, which in that chapter says God gave humankind dominion. So could you basically explain how that concept of dominion, very, very briefly explain how that morphed into the 7 mountain mandate that is now really showing up in those folks promoting the new apostolic reformation?
Yeah, that's a really good point that you bring up. And Genesis 1 is a very significant source text for many of these dominionist leaders. They claim that this goes back to the first chapter of the Bible, that God gave humankind dominion over all things. But if you look in the context, we find something that's very different. God gave Adam and Eve a garden, and he told them to take care of it. You know, they were farmers. They were to take care of the plants. They were to take care of the animals. This is not about becoming lords of creation who are going to exercise power over others. Anyone who has ever worked the ground knows that this is not about having power over anyone or anything. This is hard work, and it can be joyful work. But what God told Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, saying, I've given you dominion over all of these things, he's talking about a garden that they're to take care of, not a civilization that they are to rule. But that interpretation does get completely lost in the dominionist understanding. The origins of the 7 mountain mandate. So first off, what it is it says that there are 7 mountains of culture. And these mountains include the government, they include healthcare. Different readings have different mountains. Education is in there, families in there, arts and media is in there. And this idea that God has called us to take over all of these mountains, put our people at the top, and have our people at the top of these mountains influencing culture and really shaping policy in such a way that we're actually seeing in real life. So with regards to media, we see it, Donald Trump got Stephen Colbert canceled. Okay, that's just a clear example of what it looks like in practice, where somebody is at the top of this mountain and they're able to enforce their will all across it. This idea, it goes back, I'm going to spare you the big history. You can read American Dominion if you want to see the bigger history. But there's a man named Lauren Cunningham and Bill Bright back in the 1970s. They came together and said, hey, we've got these 7 areas of culture that God has called us to influence for the kingdom of God. And it was basically the same idea that we are to take over these 7 areas of culture. And if you look at Lauren Cunningham was the founder of the organization Youth with a Mission, which is the largest missionary sending organization in the world, probably in world history. And one thing I show in American Dominion is the entanglements that YWAM has with far-right legislation in other countries, specifically in Uganda, where we had anti-queer legislation passed that does implement the death penalty, and YWAM was connected to it. So the founder of YWAM was one of the original expositors of what became the 7 Mountain Mandate. Bill Bright was the founder of Campus Crusade for Christ. He's also very well known because he produced the Jesus movie. And just about everybody has seen the Jesus movie. So these guys were saying, God has given us these spheres of society that we're to influence for the glory of God. If you look at Lauren Cunningham's sermons during the 1980s, he's very explicitly saying he's caused me to have dominion over these things. He has called us to take dominion over these things. And he's actually talking about even nation building. That missionary efforts are not about humanitarian work. They are about enacting our agenda over entire nations. And then in the around the early 2000s, I believe, Lance Wallnau picked up this idea and he called it the Seven Mountain Mandate. And he's promoted it as such ever since. And it has become very prolific, specifically within the New Apostolic Reformation. But there are many people who have heard of it and who are aware of it, who understand it, who align with it, who may have never been into a NAR church before. It has really outgrown those bounds in which it was originally formed.
I have a question about why do you think the Christian dominion has become so dominant in recent times? I mean, as you said, you can trace the ideas back to the Civil War era, and we've had religious crazes in this country forever. What happened that now this takes hold? I mean, Trump seems to be simply opportunistic in this, but the Heritage Foundation and a lot of these strong organizations that you've mentioned, why do they adopt these things now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there's several different approaches that I'm going to take in answering it. One is Jerry Falwell died in 2007. And there was this big question when he died about what's going to come next. Who's going to take over? Or is the religious right just going to die? Well, the very next year was 2008. And that's when John McCain tapped Sarah Palin as his vice presidential running mate for the presidential election in 2008. And Palin was from a Dominionist church. It was part of the New Apostolic Reformation. There was a video that circulated during the campaign that showed an apostle from Kenya praying over her against the forces of witchcraft. And so she was very much aligned with this Dominionist program. And then following the 2008 election, which McCain and Palin lost, we saw the rise of the Tea Party. And the Tea Party really brought together all of these different factions of Dominionists who, many of them have competing ideas. They don't always get along with each other. Many of them have very different theologies, so they don't always play well together. But they came together under the Tea Party, and this was starting in 2000. Well, they came under really under Sarah Palin, and then into the Tea Party, which Sarah Palin headlined in many ways. By the time Trump announced his candidacy in 2015, he actually had a lot of these individuals circling him, including Ralph Reed, the guy that I was talking to you about regarding the school boards. Ralph Reed had endorsed Trump for president back in 2012. And then in 2015, that's when he made the decision that he was going to run. But there's another answer to this. So that's if we look at the big picture on the political level. But if we look at the churches, and I just have to emphasize, this thing has grown in churches. It has not grown in political parties. Political parties use it. And now Dominionism and the Republican Party, in many ways they are one and the same. But how have they grown among people who might be apolitical or who were apolitical or might have even been politically liberal or centrist? The biggest answer, or the best answer I can give you to that is through worship music. And that's a very surprising answer, But if you look at these churches, these new Apostolic Reformation churches, they have profoundly gifted worship leaders that they bring in from all over the world. Bethel Church in Redding, California, I read about it quite a bit in American Dominion. They have at least 2 labels that have come out of their church, award-winning labels. They sweep the Dove Awards every year. The Dove Awards, it's like the Christian Music Awards, and Bethel Church gets them constantly. What we don't realize is happening is that Bethel is spreading its dominion theology through its worship music. And I go to a progressive Methodist church, and I was just in the early service, and there was a song by Bethel in the early service. I was a little bit shocked. But every time that churches use their music, we have to pay a licensing fee to Bethel. And so Bethel is loaded. They get so much money from their music. When people listen to it off of iTunes, when people pull it up on YouTube, they're giving money to Bethel. And then whenever people hear this music and they find Bethel Church, they end up reading the books and getting sucked into the dominion theology. It sounds really great on paper. At Bethel, it's all about faith healing. God's going to heal you of whatever is plaguing your body. It's going to give you a miraculous healing. I actually opened American Dominion with this story at Bethel Church of them attempting to resurrect a 2-year-old who died. But these dominionist ideas that are deeply rooted in a history of white supremacism are getting laundered through the worship music. And the worship music is spreading far and wide, and that is sucking people into these ecosystems.
Hey, Joe, I have a question. Yeah, sure.
Hi, I'm Pat Brookshire. I was thinking through some of the things you were talking about earlier, and it reminded me from history a thing called the Know Nothing Party. Just prior to the Civil War in the 1850s, I believe. Did in your research and what you have developed, did you look back that far into the Know Nothing Party to see how they represented and what their belief system was?
Yeah, that's a really great question. America does have quite a history of populist movements, and I didn't go pre-Civil War, and for dominionism, I really only touched on the Civil War. It's something I have some familiarity with, but I'm just not really able to speak about it on an expert level. But we definitely do have a very strong history of populist grassroots movements that do become very transformative.
Deacon Joe, I just started reading this, and you may have more information because we want to know more.
Oh, there's plenty out there. I was going to ask if you could, we're 50, the bicentennial of our country was 1976. And at that time, Jerry Falwell was, I would say, percolating in his area. But could you basically just provide maybe a thumbnail sketch of how Jerry Falwell developed this concept that we were founded as a Christian nation? What type of spin he put on that, and then 50 years later, where we're looking now at America 250, and how that spin has changed from Falwell, and we realize there's other folks involved with Falwell, but from like 1976 to 2026, and how the spin on that. What people call a false narrative that we that America was founded as a Christian nation, how that spin has sort of changed over 50 years.
Yeah, so Falwell followed a theological system called dispensationalism, and what it really looks like to him is his entire theology was built around the belief that the rapture is going to happen at any moment. If you guys remember the Left Behind books that became very popular in the 1990s, early 2000s, that's all about the rapture and then the judgment of God that falls on the earth, which is a period called the tribulation. So Falwell was completely enmeshed with this belief system, and central to dispensationalism is this idea of separatism, that God has called the church to be completely separate from the world, and we're not to engage with it. And even during the height of the civil rights movement, Falwell was preaching, we're not supposed to be getting involved. Now, what he was really saying is, don't be helping those civil rights agitators, because there were a lot of mainline progressive Christians who were supporting the civil rights movement, and he was saying, no, we are only called to save souls. We're not supposed to be getting involved in any social causes. Well, he had been involved in anti-integrationist efforts going back to the 1950s, but he was very limited by his theology because he believed that the rapture is going to happen at any time, any moment. He believed he was not going to die, that he was going to be taken up in the rapture. So he never really developed a long-term plan. He never had a long-term strategy because he believed that the world at any moment only has 7 years left. The rapture is going to happen, and then 7 years of tribulation, and then Christ is going to return. We're going to get a new heaven and a new earth. But in the 1970s, you're right, he actually changed his stance, and he started agitating with this narrative that America is a Christian nation. What changed is that in 1973, the Securities and Exchange Commission got onto him because he had been selling bonds to pay for improvements at Liberty, the school that became Liberty University, and those bonds came back completely worthless. So the SEC started chasing him down. He got in a lot of trouble for that, almost lost his whole empire that he'd been building, his church, the day school for the K through 12 school that he ran, the university, the radio and television ministry. It almost all got shut down because of the SEC interfering. So then he changed his tune, and he took a very activist stance, saying, no, America's a Christian nation. Christians are supposed to be active in their government. We're supposed to be influencing our government. And he went on a 50-state tour in the 1970s with his college singers from Liberty University, or the school that became Liberty University. They sang at all of the state capitals, on the Capitol steps, on courthouses, and he preached a sermon called America Back to God, which it outlined his belief that, America's going to hell because the judgment of God is about to fall, but there's a window of opportunity, and we can take advantage of this window of opportunity to turn America back. And that became the religious right. But it was really, so much of it was embedded in racist beliefs, and he didn't think that the SEC should have anything to say about the fact that he had been selling bonds that came up worthless. And there were people, my aunt and uncle have lived in Lynchburg, Virginia, which is where he was stationed. They lived there for their entire adult lives. And they told me that there were a lot of people, like senior citizens on fixed incomes, who lost everything when those bonds came back worthless. But Falwell was always constrained by his theology because he believed that the rapture is going to happen at any moment. So no long-term planning. But what's happened since Falwell is the Dominionists have gone into the mainstream of the religious right for all these reasons that I explained, and they are not constrained by a belief in the rapture. They, instead of belief in the rapture, they believe in what they call a victorious church, which is that the church is going to force out all of the works of the devil, and the works of the devil would include civil government. and would include public education. So it's something that they definitely built on the movement that Falwell developed. Falwell could have never gone as far as the Dominionists have. He was constrained by his belief in democracy. Dominionists are not constrained by belief in democracy. They are very comfortable with the idea that we should have a king.
So I think, as you point out in your book, the shift that Falwell had was basically he was trying to influence democracy, and now we've shifted to where there is a movement to do away with democracy and move towards. And various writers have pointed this out and even argued for it, that based on Christian dominionism, we should have a king.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm wondering, and I'll betray my age here, but I can remember Jerry Falwell when the moral majority first took root in about 1979, and I was in the military at that time, but when I would come home to my parents' house, my mom would have a copy of the moral majority newspaper, and then about the same time I was involved with a church during my military time with young adults there where rush duty was at least talked about, and then as you point out in your book, and I wasn't aware of this, C. Peter Wagner out of Fuller Seminary, his writings on, he was the church growth guru back in the 80s and early 90s. And he was quoted, his works were quoted when I was in seminary in the early 90s. And so I'm just curious on your take on this. How did we miss the full story on these individuals? That's what I ask myself. How did I miss what Falwell was all about? How did I miss rush duty? I mean, we all thought rush duty was nuts, but how did I miss his backstory and C. Peter Wagner? How did we miss that? It's sort of like, to me, they've hidden behind facades.
They've hidden out in the open.
Right. What was that again?
They've been hiding out in the open.
Hiding out in the open. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I guess and I'm just thinking about, the 70s and the 80s and the 90s where these three individuals that you trace in your book, American Dominion, unless we, or me personally, were to probe into their background, we were just getting whatever stories they wanted. We were just receiving however they wanted to spin I'm going to call it the philosophy or the theology they were espousing at that time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one thing that really concerns me is these are people who should have never gone mainstream. If you look at the magazine Christianity Today has a lot to do with why these guys went mainstream. Not so much Falwell, but with Rush Junie, they wrote about when he came out with his, it wasn't the one his book that's modeled on Institutes of the Christian Faith. He wrote a massive tome back in the 1970s that was promoted by Christianity Today. and I forget the name of it is slipping my mind, but it was modeled on John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Faith. And then with Doug Wilson, he should have never gone mainstream. Okay, like we should have, the second that he crawled out of Moscow, Idaho, and tried to preach to a national audience, we should have been like, you brag about being what you call a paleo Confederate. He basically says that he's a neo Confederate, but he understands that the South lost the war, and so that's what makes him different from the other neo Confederates. Well, in about 2015, he wrote a book called Evangellyfish, and I read it. It's awful. Don't even try to read it. But Christianity Today made it their fiction book of the year. So all of a sudden, Doug Wilson, who is very sympathetic to the Aryan Nations compound that's 90 miles away from him, is on the cover of Christianity Today, which has a readership of 250,000. That should have never happened. But he went mainstream in the same publication that mainstreamed Rushdoony.
Are there any, okay. Another question coming.
Appreciate you being here. My question is really not what's going on in the past, but if you go from Jerry Falwell up to Douglas Wilson, we've got a progression of leadership that extends to what do you contribute a lack of leadership to contradict it?
Yeah, and I think the biggest problem is what Joseph pointed out. We haven't taken the time to understand what's actually going on with this movement. The foreword to American Dominion was written by Julie Ingersoll, who has been researching Dominionism for decades, an extremely intelligent, extremely accomplished scholar. And what she wrote in the foreword is, all of these ideas were so fringe that people didn't pay attention to them. Like, it's so crazy that it just didn't merit our attention. And if there were people trying to study these guys, they were kind of laughed off. Like, why are you bothering with studying the crazy crazies? Well, now they have control over all three branches of government. And we're just now realizing, oh, this actually was a thing. This was building for decades. This is not new. This is not an anomaly. But we do need to move this thing back to the fringes. I don't think it's going to ever go away entirely, but we need it to go back to the fringes.
We've talked about books today, but I'm wondering if you would comment on television news and even some of the movies being put out.
Yeah, there's been definitely a surge of Christian movies, and you have PureFlix, the Christian streaming service. I believe it's run by a team that's associated with the New Apostolic Reformation, PureFlix is. The Mountain of Media is one of the 7 mountains of culture. So there's been a very concerted, well-coordinated effort to, if not take over Hollywood, then at least produce a parallel movie industry that is going to be every bit as successful.
Would you comment on TV news?
Sure. The idea that it's fake news did not originate with Donald Trump. For decades, really about a century, ever since the 1920s, conservative evangelicals who come out of the fundamentalist movement have been very questioning towards mainstream media and mainstream science, especially with the growth of evolutionary theory and its promotion in public schools, alongside the putting images on the news in the 1960s and 1970s about the civil rights movement, the images of civil rights peaceful protesters getting shot with water cannons and attacked by dogs. the images of the Vietnam War that went on the mainstream news, these contradicted the narrative that was being promoted in these circles, like the idea that America is for white people. That's a very glossed over statement that I just made. But I mean, the fundamentalist movement was a very segregationist movement as well. Jerry Falwell was a lifelong segregationist who promoted apartheid in South Africa. He was in favor of it. So when we see these images on the news, that suggests that maybe America is not doing a great job in Vietnam, and maybe America has failed in its treatment of racial minorities. Well, this is contradicting the narrative that is dominant in these circles, and so we're not going to trust the news. Not we're going to question our narrative, but we're going to question the information that's coming to us. And to an extent, questioning your sources, that's a really good thing to do. But we also need to be questioning our own narratives and the stories that we're telling ourselves. And so there has developed over the process of really a century a distrust of mainstream news sources. And that just came to a head with Donald Trump. And there is this entire media ecosystem that you would not even know about if you weren't paying attention to it. Where, we might be flabbergasted by what goes on Fox News and Breitbart, but have you seen Flashpoint? Flashpoint puts that stuff on steroids, just takes it and runs with it. I mean, the day after the Capitol riot, Flashpoint was justifying it. And this is a show that's run by the New Apostolic Reformation. If you've not been watching the YouTube videos that are put out every single day by Dutch Sheets, then, these guys are not watching mainstream media. They don't have to, because at this point, there is a sufficiently well-developed media ecosystem that provides them with all of the news and all the entertainment that they need.
Well, Dr. Ladner, we thank you very much for your time. Seen any other questions? I would just give you the final word. What words of encouragement or advice would you give to us as we deal in various ways with friends, family that have been swept up or at least wading into this Christian dominion, Christian nationalism universe, and just wanted to give you the last word.
I would go back to what I said earlier this afternoon for you guys. When we look at children with special needs, and I work with children's services, so I work with children who have been removed from their homes because of abuse and neglect. And there's many people in my life who I love who have special needs, and they rely so much on the infrastructure we have developed that supports them. And is our infrastructure perfect? No. We could be doing so much better. We could be doing so much more for people who have special needs, who might have disabilities, for children who have experienced abuse and neglect. We could be doing so much more for them. But what's happening with the rise of dominionism and how it has been reshaping our civil government and our society, the programs that are getting funded, the programs that are getting cut, these are the people who are being hurt the most. And so I would just have a conversation, make it very friendly, and get straight to the heart of the matter. Is there a child in your life that you love who has special needs? Because the fact is that taking away the funding for programs, for social programs, it's hurting these kids and their families the most.
Well, again, thank you very much for your time. I'm glad you connected with us back in February. And we just appreciate you being with us, and we wish you well on your journey. So So again, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's been wonderful joining you guys.